The White House is urging Congress to pass a disaster relief package for communities affected by hurricanes Helene and Milton.
President Biden yesterday asked the House to allocate almost $100 billion in emergency funding.
We received the White House's request. I think it's $98 billion. So we'll go to work, of course, evaluating that, and we're going to make sure we deliver for the hurricane victims and the people that have suffered from that. I come from a hurricane state. I know how important that is. But there's a deliberate process that, we go through.
A month ago, Speaker Johnson said that getting disaster aid would be a priority upon his Congress's return this month. I hope the Speaker honors that commitment and works with Democrats to get disaster aid done as soon as we can. We should not kick the can down the road nor withhold vital resources the federal government needs to properly help recovering communities.
The funding would go to 16 agencies, including FEMA, the EPA, and several federal government departments. House Speaker Mike Johnson said when visiting North Carolina after Hurricane Helene that Congress would take bipartisan action to support recovery efforts.
But Johnson told the media on Sunday there's a chance the House may only pass appropriations bills early next year. By then, Republicans will be in control of both chambers of Congress and the White House. And staying with that, for a look at how this money would be spent, we have Pete Sepp, president of the National Taxpayers Union. Good morning, Pete. Good to have you. What would this $100 billion in disaster relief President Joe Biden is urging Congress to pass be allocated towards?
Well, because it's being allocated across a number of departments, you would have cleanup efforts, you would have relief aid for victims, nutrition, housing assistance, infrastructure repairs, a whole gamut of things. But I would urge Congress to take a real microscope to this request because in the past, the Federal Emergency Management Agency has had severe problems handling these large influxes of money, making sure they get to the right recipients and that the money is spent wisely. We also have the question of how to actually pay for all of this emergency spending. The member of Congress that was quoted in the previous segment was saying we shouldn't kick the can down the road when it comes to disaster aid. Well, we shouldn't kick the can down the road when it comes to figuring out how we're going to offset all of this emergency money with funding cuts elsewhere. It can be done, and in fact, it exists across numerous places in government.
Yeah, and how would you recommend it be done? Where would you recommend drawing money from?
I would start with unobligated funds in bills that have already passed. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, for example, that passed a couple of years ago. There are tens of billions of dollars in unobligated funds, mostly for transportation and infrastructure projects. Well, take the emergency funding we need to repair all the infrastructure out of that. There's also unobligated funding in the American Rescue Plan Act that passed years ago. Of all things, tens of billions. Again, the Federal Emergency Management Agency has something on the order of $20 billion of COVID funding that it hasn't used. Why not put it toward this bill? These opportunities exist throughout the government, not just these traditional waste, fraud, and abuse, but actual unobligated monies that could be put to better use now. And that's what we're talking about here, setting priorities. Sure, those infrastructure projects and the COVID aid had their purposes at the time, but now there's something more important to do with the money.
Okay, and will Congress be able to get hurricane relief funding passed before the end of the year, do you think?
If they put their minds to it collectively and do it in a fiscally responsible manner with the House of Representatives taking the lead and saying, look, we're not just going to open the vault doors of the bank again and not care where the money goes or how it's spent. We're going to do this with caution and oversight so that people who need the money get it as quickly as possible. And the federal government has a watchful eye over all of it.
Okay, and you mentioned how there are different problems in the way that FEMA will spend money. Can you go back in the list and expand on that?
Oh, certainly. in years past, from the hurricanes that hit Louisiana under George W. Bush, the fact that aid checks were being let out for folks to go use at strip clubs. That was a scandal at one point in time. Perhaps the biggest scandal is the National Flood Insurance Program. Congress already bailed it out in several years ago to the tune of $17 billion, but it's now in debt again, more than $20 billion. This is a program managed by FEMA, and it is on the Government Accountability Office's high-risk list for waste, fraud, and abuse. So this is a troubled agency. You don't just write them a huge check and say, go to work, because when they do go to work, a lot of money often gets wasted.
Yeah, and staying with government waste, President-elect Trump created the Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, to make government more cost-effective. Do you think FEMA could benefit from the cost-cutting measures implemented by DOGE?
Yeah, they absolutely could. There needs to be better coordination of aid systems. You know, most of the effective uses of FEMA money come when local relief agencies are able to use the funds, put them to work quickly. There's not often enough coordination between what the local agencies are doing, and they're doing a lot of good, and what Washington wants them to do. In fact, that's going to be the topic of a couple of investigations in Congress, and perhaps even lawsuits from the states who are alleging that there were political motives at work in the way that FEMA responded in certain disaster areas, avoiding places that had support for one particular presidential candidate over another. Even if we get past those political questions, there are the fiscal management questions that FEMA needs to answer. They need a strong director who is willing to say, oversight comes first. If we don't watch how we spend the money, people who are suffering are going to continue to be that way.
All right. Pete Sepp, president of the National Taxpayers Union, thank you so much for your professional insight here.
My pleasure.